Well, here we are off the podium. We have our guest, Ian Paice, and he'll introduce himself. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Please say a few words about what you do, what you've done in the past.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a pianist and I'm also a musicologist. I try somehow to navigate a pathway between these two worlds. And I lecture at City University of London and I'm head of performance there. So I'm very much involved with the integration of practical music making into an academic context. But I have a much wider interest in musical education. I've been involved a few years ago in major campaigns about abusive practices in musical education, and I led a major petition calling for an inquiry following terrible revelations about abuse of all types in elite musical education there. So I've been very critical of the institutions and the culture around that for that reason. But in the last couple of weeks, in response to this article, which was also discussed in your earlier podcast with Des Oliver by Charlotte Gill on musical education, I've been involved in collating a lot of signatories for a letter which was published last week.
So how did this come about? How did you, you obviously do this kind of work, but how did this particular letter come about, and who participated? I know you wrote the letter, but you also had some help from other musicologists.
That's not exactly correct. Basically, after the article was published, there was a lot of activity on social media and elsewhere. A lot of people were quite sort of upset by what it was saying. Not because we're that bothered about one little article somewhere, but because this resonated with much wider issues that affect musical education, and we thought that that's only one possible argument, and certainly the other side should be heard. And first, I wrote to the paper suggesting writing an article from the other side, but didn't hear back from that. And some other people suggested, how about that we write a letter and see who might sign it. And it was not me who wrote the letter originally. It was the composer and oral skills instructor, Joan Arnaud Pamiers, Spanish, is working in Chicago at the moment, and he wrote the first draft. Then I and several others went over and we changed lots, so it was a joint effort. It would be wrong to give me any sort of exclusive credit for the letter. That's not the case. Jean really came up with the bulk of it. I added phrases like what's now become notorious, the romanticization of literacy, which is a slight reference to a term from the Hungarian Marxist philosopher George Lukács of the idea of romantic anti-capitalism, this idealized view of a pre-capitalist era, and a view of everything to do with culture and society there, which is held up as a shining alternative to the present day, but looks backwards rather than looks forwards. That's what I had in mind with that term.
So let's just dive right in. I know you have a lot to say about the article. Start wherever you'd like, and let's dive right into it.
Of course. Well, obviously, for those who've listened to Des Oliver's podcast, you'll probably have got the gist of this. The article was entitled, let me just check the exact title, Music Education is Now Only for the White and Wealthy. Of course, titles come from sub-editors, not from the authors, but that reasonably summed up the gist of what was being said there, I think. This article started off saying very reasonably that there was a great deterioration in music education in the UK, and various new curricular requirements, which particularly put emphasis upon science and languages, had led to a sidelining of music, and I think as I say, sidelining of other creative subjects is equally true. And it's led to gradual falls in numbers of people taking music at GCSE and A level, which are the major examinations that people in the UK take at ages 16 and 18 in secondary education. And one of the conclusions from this was that more and more those who get a musical education tend to be those either who are privately educated or those who are at state schools but receive private tuition. And it was also said that there's a low representation of those from minority ethnic backgrounds. Now, actually, the figure was given of 10%, and the total population of the UK that can be described as black, Asian, or minority ethnics is between 12 or 13. So that's an underrepresentation, but not a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone knows, within the classical world, that there's certainly a substantial number of East Asian musicians involved in this field at all.
Of course.
But anyhow, all of that, up to that point in the article, I could go along with, and I think a lot of people could. But it was what was drawn from it that was problematic. The claims were that music's always been taught in much too academic way, too much of an emphasis on theory, and particularly on musical notation, which was described as, I quote, a cryptic, tricky language, rather like Latin, that can only be read by a small number of people, most of whom have benefited from private education. Now, that sentence in particular, that annoyed me very much, and a lot of people. There's huge amount of evidence going back over a long period in history in Britain and in many other countries of people from all sorts of backgrounds mastering notation, and that would include things like many brass band players in the 19th century who would learn. It would include many people who are involved in music making, not just as classical players, but also those who go on to be session musicians, those who play in the pits in musical theatre, and for that matter, actually more than a small number of jazz musicians and backing bands for pop acts and so on. Notation, or if I say notation, what is loosely called Western musical notation, that's a problematic term as well, but I'll come back to that, is something which has had a profound effect upon many fields of music making, and I don't think that's a negative one by any means. I do not accept that people are in any sense disadvantaged by being able to read music, as some have claimed. You can see great jazz musicians like Jelly Roll Morton or Duke Ellington or Miles Davis, who all read music.
That's
and
right.
Often, in some cases, often published their music as well, which led to its wider dissemination. Anyhow, that's just going back to Gill's article. She talks about how she found notation hard as a child, which should certainly be sympathetic. Some people do have a difficulty with it, though I'm not convinced that there's any necessary link between that and social class or anything like that. But I don't accept that it is a highly difficult skill, certainly not compared to learning a foreign language. Yeah. She compared it to Latin. If you think of the range of vocabulary needed to be learned there, and the fact it's no longer generally a living language. And many people from not particularly privileged Catholic backgrounds learnt Latin prior to Vatican II, when it was still quite widely used in the churches there. Yeah. So what she proposed from this, or at least implied, was that musical education needed a greater degree of diversity, and this emphasis on notation and theory were acting against this. And what bothered me a lot there was knowing that the situation in these times of austerity in Britain are seeing a good deal of cuts to musical education in general, which I think is absolutely deplorable. Well, sorry, cuts to education in general, certainly to state education. And schools are under immense pressure to cut provision in whatever way they can, just to balance their own books. And I fear that if a requirement for teaching and learning musical notation or theory is taken away from many schools, then many of them will see that as the easiest way to cut costs. Yeah. I'm not blaming the schools for that, but I see how necessity breeds such things. And when they have inspectors breathing down their throats on one hand, but also people looking at their finances on the other, they'll be in an impossible situation. So I really be very concerned about taking that requirement out from musical education. Though there is evidence, which I'll come back to, that there are many ways in which it's been relatively marginalised and minimised anyhow. And just to say one other thing about Gill's article, because recently I've been reading more about so-called populist politics, populism as maybe as an ideology, but also a political strategy, which can be found on various parts of the political spectrum. And I think we've seen it very obviously in the case of Brexit in the UK and with the election of Donald Trump. Yeah. But those political theorists who've looked at it in detail find certain recurrent tropes in political language which they identify as populist. Often the writers identify themselves as somehow marginalized, but also speaking for majority. And there's a disdain for elites and a disdain for experts in favor of a more supposedly common sense approach. And there's a lot of cold water poured on forms of highly skilled expertise. And I see this strategy absolutely through Gill's article, and also in an earlier article she published last year on choral singing. There's the idea that somehow bringing reasonably developed skills into an education excludes people, and it sort of reduces diversity. But I think that's a very shallow argument, and it's actually a very patronizing argument. It deals with individuals or groups in society only in terms of what they have currently achieved in current social conditions, perhaps with particular educational provision, not dealing with potential. I think to sort of write off large chunks of society as unable to acquire all sorts of specialized knowledge and specialized expertise is extremely patronizing. And I really deplore an educational philosophy that is based upon that sort of populist reasoning.
Well, I was going to say, in her article, it said something about, choirs, obviously, and she's done another article about choirs, but is it truly that hard in the UK to join a community or an amateur choir? Because in the US, that's probably one of the easiest things to do.
Yes, I think it is over here. There's a long choral tradition, goes back centuries here. And it depends. Some choirs teach mostly orally, some teach mostly from notation. It depends on the choir in question, but certainly all such things can be found.
Yeah.
And when I was at primary school, which was a relatively ordinary primary school, the hymn books that we sung from all had the music in, just the vocal line, not the piano part. I always wanted to see the piano part, but I always just had the vocal line. And I think that was true in many schools. Many people had those. So they would have had some exposure to very basic notation through those, which feeds into choral singing. Yeah. I know that my own parents, who were not from any sort of privileged background at all, far from it, they sang in some amateur dramatic societies who put on various forms of old musical theatre and so on. And they had copies of vocal scores for various musicals, which were kept in the pianist stores. So when we got a piano, when I was 6, I would get them out and spend a lot of time bashing through them at the piano, which was great for sight reading skills.
And that's another way. You just have to.
They were not trained musicians at all, but I think there were many people like that who, just through various sort of amateur activity, had picked up some basics of notation. I don't believe it's that hard.
Yeah, I was going to say,
but I do accept that there are some people who may have some learning difficulties, and special arrangements have to be made for them.
Of course.
Absolutely. So we had this letter, and after getting it down to 250 words, which was the largest amount that the Guardian were prepared to print, which meant leaving out lots of more detailed arguments many of us would have liked to have made. Then a lot of signatories came flooding in, basically, which was very gratifying.
And some big names.
Some very big names, such as, for example, the conductor, Sir Simon Rattle, or the composers, Sir James Macmillan, or Michael Nyman, or Brian Fernie-Ho, or Howard Goodall, the director of music at the South Bank Centre in London, Gillian Moore. There was
Sir James Galway.
Yes, absolutely, Sir James Galway and his wife, Lady Galway. There, and then lots of people from who are variously sort of musicologists, music educationists, and so on. But just as important, lots of general musicians and lots of people who are doing the really important work, which is teaching young people of all sorts of backgrounds music, and teaching them music notation and teaching them music theory. And so I've lost count of the number of people who informed me of how much exception they took to the idea that these things were not for such sectors in society, because they've been teaching them to those for decades and had great success with the process. So I cannot accept Gill's argument about that, and neither can the now currently over 730 people who have signed this letter.
And it's just sad to see this, because it makes me feel like, you mentioned earlier, but it seems like it might be not just her, but a lot of people out there who feel and think this way, and it's really frustrating. What can we do as musicians to prevent this from happening, or to help teach people better about how important music education is in general?
Well, I think this relates to some wider issues that have come up in academic and other debates about music education in general, and lots of actions and developments in the field of education that have resulted from it, which in some ways I think have been positive, but have also had some negative consequences as well. And I think these need looking at again. If I could just say a bit more about this in some more detail. A few decades ago, there were various people involved in primary, secondary and tertiary education in the English-speaking world who critiqued what was seen as an overly exclusive curriculum, which was mostly focused upon a so-called Western classical tradition. Now, I should add that I do believe that term itself is misleading, as such a tradition has many roots, not just from Europe, but also from parts of North Africa and parts of the Middle East, and certainly in the 20th century, and to some extent in the 19th as well. It has had a global reach. There have been extensive contributions, as I said before, from East Asian musicians, and plenty from Latin America and elsewhere too. So whether it makes sense to call it Western classical music any longer, or what even we would define as that, I think is very problematic. But anyhow, from around about the late 1980s, there were some musicologists associated with what was called so-called new musicology, who set up a very clear dichotomy between the classical and the popular, which mirrored some debates about high culture and low culture, which had gone on in wider fields of the study of culture in academia and elsewhere. The paradigm, I'm simplifying a bit here, but roughly speaking, the paradigm goes as follows. It would say that classical music is the music of dead white European males, and the work itself embodies the values of that group in various ways, right down to its very fabric. Whereas popular music is much more inclusive in all senses, inclusive in terms of gender, sexuality, in terms of multi-ethnicity, and also does not exhibit, supposedly, the so-called mind-body split. So a distinction between a sort of more physical and a more intellectual attitude towards music, which is portrayed as yet another negative properties of the so-called dead white European males. And so-called modernist music, which is often portrayed as a quite monolithic field of activity, which I don't believe it is, has come under especially strong criticism for these reasons. From this comes the idea that musical notation is another example of dead white European male hegemony compared to other forms of music which do not require it. But as far as educational prescriptions are concerned from this ideology, it would say that there should be a much greater degree of popular music in musical education at all levels, primary, secondary, tertiary. And if you take the view of some people that the so-called Western classical tradition should have no particular special or privileged place there. Now, what I would say here, I think this view is very problematic. First of all, there are other literate musical traditions from China, from India, Korea, or Indonesia, for example. If one is to sort of attack notation in general, then in one sense that is to dismiss most literate tradition. No one will be more enthusiastic than I would about the idea that, right back in primary and secondary schools, we would teach people more about other forms of notation and other cultural traditions of notation, though that would not be easy. It would certainly not be easy to learn some of the East Asian traditions, which are very complex, but certainly worthy of major study. And I also maintain that Western notation itself has developed immensely over centuries and is still doing so. A lot of the modern music I play as a soloist ensemble member uses all sorts of modifications for standard staff notation, with new symbols, sometimes doing away with sharps and flats, so as to avoid something that has tonal implications, or even using graphic or text scores. Furthermore, popular musics can be found in many parts of the world and have long histories. I've taught for many years about popular music history to undergraduates, going back to the mid-19th century, with increases in urbanization in the Western world. So looking at traditions of the music hall in London, or of the café concert in Paris, or cabaret in Berlin, that sort of thing. And there are many popular traditions that lie outside of the English-speaking world. But what I believe often happens when one makes musical education centered on pop, it's invariably about Anglo-American pop, and usually of very recent times. Many of the popular traditions, let alone non-Western classical folk and other traditions, are equally shut out. I think just dividing music into half between contemporary Anglo-American pop and then that Western classical music that's all the stuff of dead white European males is hugely simplistic and very far from a sort of balanced division of the whole realm of music throughout history and varying in time and place. And I also think music education concerns learning about music, not just making it. The study of literature is not the same as the study of creative writing, though the two can overlap.
That's right.
Nor is art history just about painting. So why should music be any different? But if you are to study about music in a way that engages with specifics, not just generalities, one needs some tools to do this. And I think that's where some types of music theory, and there are many types one can use. Even amongst those just looking at the so-called Western classical tradition, there are highly competing paradigms for engagement in that respect. And I think music education should, like all education, not simply tell pupils and students about what they likely already know, and in the case of some contemporary popular music, possibly know more about than many of their teachers do, but should take them outside of their comfort zone, introduce them to other musics, other traditions of many types. But I feel that when this sort of thinking leads to a reduction of education in a so-called Western classical tradition, then it will lead to a reduction in all sorts of other things too. And so what I see happening, and various people see this with undergraduates as well, let alone what people see teaching in secondary and primary schools, is often limited ability to engage with music in detail. It's often engagement with just very broad generalities about it, and it's a lack of any sort of theoretical training which makes it this way. And it means that a lot of what we have to teach at first-year undergraduate level is making up for what perhaps in some earlier times could have been taken for granted as already having been learned. Now, there are places that's not true everywhere, and there are people who come with very brilliant, accomplished skills, and many others who pick them up quite quickly. But I think when you make the paradigm between classical and pop, it won't just be Western classical that will go. It will be most historical popular music. It will be most non-Western music. There's no real evidence in the Western world of a high level of demand for more degrees in Indian classical music, for example. And I welcome it absolutely if there were. I think it would be fantastic if we had more people doing that. But it's between studying many types of music or sticking to which people know. And I don't think that's a healthy state of affairs. And I worry that that's happening more and more in many places.
Yeah. But it's, I'm surprised that this was written, especially with the UK in context, because UK is one of the places where I feel as though popular music is very welcomed. You know, I think it's University of Liverpool where they have a Beatles studies program, and I've just seen far more programs in the UK than even in the US for popular music.
Yes, there are lots of programs there, and many of them are absolutely excellent programs as well. And yes, Liverpool has a big focus upon popular music, not least because of its own history in terms of the bands that came from the city. And there are other ones in some other universities, such as in Newcastle, amongst the more highly ranked universities. But many of the sort of what are seen as the lower level universities have very extensive popular music study programs. But there is sometimes a bit of question about what one is teaching. Is one teaching, again, about popular music? Is one trying to learn about it in its breadth, in terms of all its attributes and in terms of its social position, everything like that? Or is one trying to train people to make popular music?
Yeah.
And there are questions about whether popular music, which has flourished outside, at least of a tertiary educational framework, there isn't a particularly strong tradition of popular musicians having learnt their craft in higher education. Though there is one, certainly in Britain, of many going through art school and developing through there. But a question of whether that sort of level of training that you'd expect at a tertiary level is as appropriate for popular musicians as for classical musicians, which has always been a sort of highly, a form of practice that tends to be dependent upon a high level of education and training. That's not to say that one's better or worse than the other for that reason, nor to say that there couldn't be some value in popular music training in higher education. But I think we shouldn't necessarily just assume that the field is the same. It's a strange situation with jazz education.
Yeah.
I mean, my own alma mater, the Juilliard School in New York, only introduced a jazz program in 2001, even though someone like Miles Davis actually attended the place a long time before then. Now, I'm very glad that they have done, and other places have done. But to me, that is interesting because in some ways it reflects the extent to which jazz has been seen as in some ways a historical idiom. I mean, it is a living idiom in many ways, but there are an awful lot of jazz musicians who are playing in an idiom which was developed in most of its essentials several decades ago. Yeah. It hasn't always been that way. There was the first ever course for studying jazz at tertiary level came about in the late 1920s in Frankfurt, of all places. It didn't last the advent of the Third Reich in 1933. But when jazz was very new, and especially very new to Germany, there were already far-sighted people who saw value in studying about the music and studying to play it there. But it's been a slow process, and not unreasonably, some people would question whether that mode of education is the best way, whether there are other approaches which work better for people in those traditions. But this is getting off the point a bit.
Yeah, well, you mentioned jazz, and as a classical musician, I just feel maybe improvisation would have been a good kind of a midpoint for classical musicians to maybe have an opportunity to interact with other genres, because in improvisation you learn how to play things maybe by ear or listening, and I think this would be a great way to kind of connect to different genres, whether it's pop, jazz, or folk music, from coming from a classical background, just being able to, when you listen to something, say something with your instrument.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
And that's not being taught in the U.S., for example. I don't know about U.K., but that's very limited in the U.S.
I think it's quite limited over here. In my institution, we do actually have an improvisation ensemble, which a wonderful cellist, friend of mine, Shirley Smart, runs, and which brings together a mixture of relatively free improvisational modes, improvisation based upon folk tunes, jazz improvisation, but all done in an oral manner, and that's really brilliant. And there are many improvisers working in lots of fields, and who can work with musicians of all sorts of musical backgrounds to do that. And I'd love to see more of that.
Yeah, I just never understand when you cut something out.
Themselves. They were also extremely fluent in musical notation.
Exactly.
There was no contradiction seen there. It's just maybe in the later 19th century that, to some extent, improvisation becomes a less central feature of Western musical practice. Yeah. But even then, you can find practices that continued, such as so-called preluding, where a pianist would sit down and improvise an introduction before they were going to play a notated piece. Or if you look at the accounts of the pianist Hans von Bülow, of how he'd play all the last 5 Beethoven sonatas in one concert, and he'd put some connecting passages in between them so he didn't have to stop. They're really quite amusing to look at, those sort of things.
But it's...
And there are fields of contemporary music, sort of modernist music I play, which have involved a lot of improvisation. Certainly things involving graphics and text scores, for example.
Yeah. And it's nice to see that the younger generation is picking up on things like this, and it's happening. As you mentioned, I've seen quite a few pianists or instrumentalists in general that do start out with some kind of an improvised piece in the moment before they continue on to play their rest of their program. I was going to ask you about music
Let me just say something more on on improvisation, because it's easy to underestimate how much of a high-level skill I think improvisation itself is.
Of course.
I've worked a little bit with some very skilled improvisers, and with some composers who are also improvisers, and I'm quite in awe of them, what they can do. Many people start off improvising, and they often start just repeating a lot of things that they already know. That improvisation becomes a sort of memory process, whereas the skilled improvisers gain a certain degree of self-reflexive consciousness when they're playing to how they can move beyond that, and that takes some time to acquire. So, improvisation in schools, I think it wants. If it's just people moving around a few chords, that's not. That's no more of a sort of high-level thing than would be doing the same. Playing from a form of notation. I think improvisation shouldn't be seen as a soft option at all. And I absolutely like to see most musicians learning some improvisation as part of their education.
Well, this is kind of getting off point a little bit, but music education, should it be for everyone with all these cuts happening? What's your take? Should it be for everyone? Can we make it for everyone? Can everyone take part in this luxury, or what some people call it a luxury?
I certainly don't think it should be a luxury. It should undoubtedly be available to everyone. There will be some people who find it's really not for them, or not something that they particularly want to do. But I think everyone, at least at a young level, should have some exposure to music, just as I think everyone should with literature or with the visual arts, which are also often very neglected in education, and with dance as well, on whatever level. It all depends on which level of education one's talking. I'm worried that creative subjects in general, in the English-speaking world, where there's arguably or maybe are the most developed capitalist nations, that a more utilitarian view of education, a more vocational view in which education is valued to the extent to which it provides very specific skills for particular types of work. In those fields, creative education can easily get marginalized, and that's what I greatly worry about. Education should be a much broader thing. It's not just about getting people who can do certain types of service industry jobs. I think it would be very sad if it becomes that.
What can we expect from the great names in the 21st century? Some of them responded to the article. Sir Simon Rattle, Sir James Galway, and others have responded to that article. But what can they do outside of just responding to that article and agreeing? What can they do in their daily life, maybe in their life in general? What can we expect from them?
Well, many of them already do important things. Mm-hmm. Many of them are involved in educational programs, often education programs in quite deprived areas. Mm-hmm. I think Sir Simon Rattle has done such things in the US in various places, and with fantastic results often. What can they do in general? Well, just taking a part in sort of wider political debates about musical education is itself a form of action. Doing voluntary educational work is obviously important, but it shouldn't be left to volunteer work from so-called great names alone. This thing should be supported properly by the state. It should be available to all people. Otherwise, I think work to ensure that the professional field is not closed to people of different backgrounds. And there's plenty of evidence, unfortunately, that it is highly exclusive in some realms, at least, in terms of people's backgrounds. Not least because of the finance of it. Many musical careers are not particularly well paid and require people to spend quite some years just getting little bits of work here, there, and everywhere, which is much easier to do if you have some independent wealth, if you have some, if you don't have a mortgage to pay or like that. But so schemes which will help people from all backgrounds enter the profession, I think, are really important things.
I mean, go ahead. Yeah, I would love to hear your ideas. Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, because I'd like to sort of look at this from the other side of the argument, because something else that's come up at the same time as this debate is a wider debate about so-called privilege and musical education. And hopefully you can see. I mean, I think the issues of privilege in music education are vital, and I think it's an absolute calamity when some people are prevented from making an invaluable contribution to music just simply because of circumstances of birth which were not their own choosing. But this is, I mean, it takes me back to this issue of populist politics. There's an excellent writer on musical education, Estelle Jorgensen, who wrote a very good article about the declining place of Western classical music, which she finds it as a problematic term as well, for the reasons I said earlier. She said, where once it held a privileged place in education, it seems to have acquired, in some quarters at least, a negative connotation as a bastion of elitism and privilege. And with this in mind, there have been, it just came up a few days after the Gill article, there was something called a music privilege walk was organised. This follows the model of other so-called privilege walks that I think have been quite a feature in the US and often involving students. So this one involved musicologists. And it had a whole series of questions, such things as, were you taught music theory? Do you care about notated music? Can you read more than one clef? And people have to take steps forward or steps back to demonstrate their privilege in this respect. And so those who step forward are, at least by implication, being asked to so-called check their privilege. I think this is a very morbid situation. They've, just because of caring about certain types of music or having had some theoretical tuition, then is that not a major deterrent? Does that not attach a whole stigma to such things? And what does this achieve? What sort of situation do we create for those eager to learn and develop more? Do they have to do this in a private or secret way? So as I compare this with the situation in the very early days of the Soviet Union, where after a short period where there was a real attack on everything to do with pre-revolutionary culture, there was then a movement which believed, in a laudable fashion, I think, that we should continue to value high culture, but do everything possible to make it available to as many people as possible, to the whole of the nation. Yeah. And even things as entrance requirements for conservatoires were modified in accordance with this, and many schemes set up for bringing very high level teaching all around the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And this,
my parents were part of that system.
Sorry?
My parents were part of that system. They grew up in the Soviet Union, and they both learned instruments. All of my family played a musical instrument at some point, and I did. I even though I came after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I still was. The system was still there, so that's where I started my education. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
That's fantastic, and I mean that system brought with it its own set of problems. Of course,
of course.
It was highly centralised.
Yes.
It probably didn't allow an awful lot of freedom of choice there, but it still produced remarkable levels of accomplishment. I think, and I don't believe that was anything particularly to do with class in those days, or particularly to do with ethnic groups, because of many ethnic groups in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So, I mean, on a more moderate social democratic level, I think some of that sort of thinking informed a lot of Western European musical education thinking in the period after 1945, that good musical provision should be provided to as many people as possible. And I still think that's an important aim. But when we get situations like, well, there was one person was claiming that, they actually claimed that if you support music theory, then you support white supremacy, which comes out of the wider arguments I was saying before. Then I just don't know where we go from there. Yeah. I find that incredibly morbid. So it seems like this is there's almost nothing, I think, in almost any culture in the world which cannot somehow be tied in to all sorts of inequalities, relationships of domination, commercial processes, and so on and so forth. Walter Benjamin said that there's no record of culture that's not also a record of barbarism. I think that's hyperbole, but there's no such thing as culture that somehow stands completely outside of the context in which it came or the context in which it has continued. But if we just concentrate on identifying all these things and roundly condemn and judge from on high all culture from this basis, then I think all we end up is a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
We should be looking for genuinely more inclusive in terms of inclusion of opportunity, and building upon the best things of all sorts of cultural practices and developing them further, rather than just judging them and condemning them, which I fear there's a whole branch of thinking on music which does a lot of that.
It's
and
unfortunate.
correspondingly sometimes idealizes all sorts of other forms of music as well. And
Well-
there's a debate going on now around the curriculum at Harvard, where it's been announced
I heard that.
at least on some of the programs, music theory will no longer be a requirement there. And I haven't yet looked into this as much detail as I want to, so I'm going to hesitate before making any big comments about it. But
it's some of these headlines. Unless I do my own research on the topic, it's hard to say, because they make such grandiose headlines, and it's actually not what it turns out to be. So.
Sure, absolutely, and I need to look at the Harvard situation more before getting that. But certainly, it does seem to be the case from what I've seen so far that at least on one program, music theory is being taken out, and I wonder about the value of doing that, even if it's on a sort of program for people with a broader background, rather than ones who are going to be so specialised in majoring in music.
Yeah.
But that's in a different context, the British one. I appreciate that. But I think music theory, even of a basic type, has value for all sorts of people, even just a small amount for engaging with music, whatever way.
Yeah.
We hear music all around us, all the time. Predominantly Anglo-American commercial popular music, but I think having the tools to understand what's going on there is no bad thing.
I was gonna say, what's something exciting we could look forward to from maybe this debate in general, this article, or just the future of music education? Is there a bright future? I'm hoping there is. Do you see it?
The current political situation in Britain and America would make me sceptical about, being too optimistic about bright futures, but I'm always a bit of an optimist, so I hope things can get better. I think having a public debate, I mean, this is not the first public debate for sure, there have been them before, but having a proper debate that brings in many people from all sorts of experience, all sorts of backgrounds, and I don't think many people, if pushed on this subject, would be able to disagree with the principle of making the best sort of musical education available to everyone. It's just a question of how we do it, how we best do it. But if we think if we can get back perhaps to the idea of thinking that education is actually about helping to push people beyond what they already have, rather than necessarily to entertain them, which I worry has become more the case. And even in higher education, with a new sort of ethos of the student as consumer, I worry that slips into things rather too much. But if we can develop that sort of thinking, and many people can come together to look for positive plans for the future and how they can be financed, then that will be a way forward.
You have anything else to say?
Well, we mentioned before about the issue of disability, because there is another letter in preparation which is very strongly critical of our letter, particularly on the grounds that that an insistence on notation is somehow discriminatory against those who, to do with various learning disabilities, have great difficulty with use of notation. Now, 200%, I would agree that we need to make provisions for people who have some sort of learning difficulty, which makes this especially hard for them. Just as we do for those with other forms of visual or oral impairment.
Yeah.
I mean, the same argument could equally be used against a focus upon oral skills, which for those with other types of learning disabilities could be especially challenging. I don't think this is a fair criticism of what we're saying. In the case of reading and writing skills, absolutely arrangements should be made to accommodate dyslexic students and help them as much as possible. But would anyone really suggest that one should relax a general emphasis on reading and writing skills as a result in education?
Yeah.
I think simply removing anything that might be seen to be harder for some people with some learning disabilities could lead to practically everything in education being suspect. And I can't really see how we can go forward that way.
You could say that about any subject, like you mentioned. You could say that about any field.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, without any doubt, and like any educator, I've dealt with those who've had some learning difficulties and worked on exactly how we can modify the requirements, modify the syllabus, modify the way that certain things are tested in line with that. Like any educator, that's fundamental. Like many people in any form of work there who've worked to try and accommodate such things as best as possible. But I cannot see how that sort of negates the fundamental argument of keeping notation and theory as a core part of musical education.
Yeah, and especially in the art fields and music field, in specifically, I've been a part of. Music educators, from my experience, there might be some bad ones out there, and I'm sure there are, just as in any field. But they're so welcoming, they're so open to just creating an atmosphere, an environment where it welcomes everyone, that I just don't see this being a problem. I'm hoping all the music educators out there, when they see someone struggling with something, they'll find new ways and new approach to deal with everyone and all situations. So I really hope this doesn't create problems or take away from the notation in general or music, the way we teach music. I think there's always room for improvement, though. So hoping there's the in the future the new generation finds new ways of collaborative efforts and new ways to approach and teach music and perform.
There have been, in the field of musicology, developments that you can date back to about the 1970s in a developed form, particularly affecting popular music studies, where some have taken a more sociological or anthropological approach, and I've been involved a bit in some public debates on this subject. So they're looking more at the role of music in society, at the demographics who are involved with it, in terms of how it's involved in identity formation, or just in terms of the processes and the institutions that are involved in its making and dissemination. All of that's extremely important, absolutely. But I feel those are different fields. Those are part of cultural sociology or cultural anthropology and so on, which without any doubt musicians and musicologists can learn from and benefit from, but I don't think those should be in place of actual engagement with sounding music. I think that's the one thing that musicians and musicologists have that defines their field, if you like. It makes their field something that isn't just a subset of some other discipline. And I wouldn't like to see music education or musicology become that way. Sorry, that might seem like a bit of a tangent, but that's trying to sort of respond to the point about music educators and how we find new ways. I think we should broaden our profession and broaden our approaches as far as possible. We shouldn't lose sight of what makes it particular and what ultimately people hear music first and foremost. Even if you're just in a shopping mall and you're hearing music, it's sounds, that's what you're hearing. It's not just the industry that's producing them, though that affects the sounds, but how are all the other things, all the social processes, all the identity formation, how are they actually manifested in the sounds? That's a really key question. That's not easy to answer by any means, but I think that's those things are core questions for those dealing with music. Well, but if I'm allowed to give a plug for my blog,
go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to say,
which is simply ianpace.wordpress.com. I think is it .com? Just check.
I'll make sure to put
.wordpress.com. There are quite a few debates on that subject, and also a debate which came about a year ago after a talk on Radio 4 by a professor of popular music studies, where he attacked dead white German composers, and a lot of responses to that, which developed some of the themes that I've been talking about before.
I feel so bad. I feel so bad saying this, but I'm happy and sad about this whole situation, because the article made me read and find out about people that I didn't know about. For example, I was just reading about you after I found out about you. I read about you, and I was just so upset with myself that I didn't even know you in the first place before this article. So it's so many great musicians out there and so many great thinkers out there that we don't know about. So sometimes these bad situations makes us think and find out about people who are actually doing great things out there in the world. And your blog is a great resource for a lot of people, I'm sure, and for me now.
Thank you. But I mean, as I say, this has been a multi-person effort, this thing, so you shouldn't give me too much exclusive credit for it. There's many people involved in raising this issue.
Of course.
Just simply garnering all the signatories, there'll be many others involved in publicizing it.
Of course. And hopefully we'll get some people to talk about this or other things. I don't even know if we should discuss this any further, at least from my perspective, but there's just so many things out there that we could talk about. So
sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great. And this is a new thing for me, so I'm still kind of getting used to it. I've been trying to a lot of things have bothered me growing up about the music education, just about various things that have happened in the world of conducting and music in general that have upset me or have bothered me, and I never knew how to approach it or who to talk to. So I finally said, you know what, I'm gonna start this and do this myself, and if other people want to talk about certain things, I'd welcome them to talk about it. So that's how I got started, and I'm happy you and Des agreed, and there's actually a long list of people who are now messaging me to talk about various things, so it's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Okay, well, thank you.